The freight wagon groaned into Redemption Creek under the weight of a sun that baked the very soul out of the land. Dust, fine as flour, rose in a haze, coating everything in a film of pale brown. It settled on the false fronts of the saloon and the general store, on the steepled roof of the clapboard church, and on the brim of every hat in town. It was a town that lived and breathed dust, a place where a man's worth was measured by the grit under his fingernails and a woman's by the silence she kept. From beneath the wagon's canvas cover, a figure emerged. She moved with a quiet deliberation, as if testing the stability of the earth itself. It was a woman, slight of build, dressed in a simple gray traveling dress that had seen better days but was impeccably clean. Her gloved hands clutched the handle of a small, worn carpet bag. But it was not her bag or her dress that drew the eyes of the town. It was the veil, made of a thin cream-colored lace. It was pinned fastidiously to one side of her bonnet, obscuring the entire right side of her face from temple to jaw. She was Clara Mayfield, and her arrival was an event. Heads turned on the saloon porch. Prospectors stopped their talk of gold veins and water rights to watch her. Their eyes, hard and hungry, lingered on the sway of her hips, their minds filling in the blanks of what the veil might hide. A curse, a disease, or something far more scandalous? From the mercantile. Mrs. Henderson peered over a sack of beans, her lips pursed in a tight line of judgment. Even the righteous, leaving the Wednesday prayer meeting, paused their talk of salvation to whisper of this new and mysterious sinner who had been delivered into their midst. The whispers followed her like a second shadow, a rustling, venomous thing that coiled around her ankles as she stepped onto the boardwalk. Look at that. Hiding something, that one. Where'd she come from? Some say she's from back east, fleeing a scandal. I'd wager. Clara heard them. She felt their stares like physical blows against her skin, but her posture remained straight, her spine a rod of iron. She had learned long ago that to flinch was to invite the wolves closer. Her gaze was fixed forward, on the two-story boarding house at the far end of the main street, its paint peeling in the relentless sun. With each step, the worn leather of her boots made a soft, rhythmic sound on the wooden planks, a lonely counterpoint to the town's hostile murmur. She walked a gauntlet of leering eyes and self-righteous glares, past ranchers in dusty chaps and churchgoers in starched collars, her face a mask of serene indifference, the veil a silent, defiant flag. The boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap. The woman who met her at the door was as sharp and spare as the house itself. Mrs. Gable was a widow whose piety was matched only by her pragmatism. She took in Clara's appearance in a single, sweeping glance that started at her modest bonnet and ended on the mysterious veil. Her eyes, the color of dishwater, narrowed. "You'll be Miss Mayfield," she stated. It was not a question. "I am," Clara replied, her voice soft but clear. "The room is upstairs, to the back, $10 a month, payable in advance. Meals are at 7 in the morning and 6 in the evening. Be prompt. I run a respectable house." The emphasis on the word respectable was a clear warning. It implied that Clara, by her very presence, was a threat to that respectability. Mrs. Gable saw not a seamstress come to fill a need, but damaged goods. She saw a secret, and in a town like Redemption Creek, secrets were a currency that could buy a woman nothing but trouble. The room was small, tucked under the eaves, with a slanted ceiling and a single window that overlooked a dusty alley. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a rickety wooden chair. It was stark and lonely, but it was hers. Clara set her carpetbag on the bed and, with trembling fingers, unpinned her hat. She did not remove the veil. She walked to the small, wavy mirror above the washstand and looked at the woman reflected there. She saw a stranger in a familiar prison. One side of her face was smooth and pale, with a wide gray eye and a delicate arch of a brow. The other side remained hidden, a country she never allowed anyone else to visit. She closed her eye, took a slow, deep breath, and let the sounds of the town, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rowdy laughter from the saloon, wash over her. This was her new life, a quiet, careful existence on the edge of the world. The town's previous seamstress, a kindly woman named Mrs. Albright, had succumbed to the influenza that had swept through the territory that spring. Her small shop, situated between the barber and the land office, had sat empty for months. Clara unlocked the door with a key Mrs. Gable had given her, the metal cold and heavy in her hand. Inside, the air was still and smelled of dust and old wool. A film of grime covered everything: the long cutting table, the shelves of thread, the silent, hulking shape of the sewing machine in the corner. For Clara, this was not a place of dust and decay, but a sanctuary. She spent the next 2 days in a fever of activity. She swept the floors, scrubbed the windows until they gleamed, and polished the wood of the cutting table until it shone. She oiled the sewing machine with a gentle, practiced hand, its intricate metal parts moving smoothly under her touch. This machine was her deliverance. Its steady, rhythmic clatter was a language she understood, a voice that would speak for her when she could not. It would turn thread and cloth into a life. She began her work quietly, mending torn shirts for miners, hemming dresses for the ranchers' wives, stitching baptismal gowns for the church. She was a meticulous worker, her stitches small and even, her craftsmanship undeniable. The women of the town, though still suspicious, could not fault her skill. They would come into her shop, their gazes sliding sideways toward her veil, their questions unspoken but hanging heavy in the air. Clara would meet their curiosity with a polite, impenetrable reserve. She answered their questions about fabric and thread, measured their waists and inseams, and never, ever, offered a word about herself. She never removed her veil. In time, she became a fixture in the town, a silent, shrouded figure bent over her work, as much a part of the landscape as the weathered mountains that loomed in the distance. Eli Cartwright rode into town the way the dusk fell, slowly, quietly, and without fanfare. He was a man made of sun and leather and silence. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, he sat his horse with an easy grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. His face was weathered, browned by the sun, and etched with fine lines around his eyes. A faint, silvery scar cut a path from the corner of his left eye to his temple, a memento from a cavalry saber in a life he no longer spoke of. He broke wild horses for the mining company up in the high country, a solitary job for a solitary man. The war had taken his brother and his taste for conversation. Grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a quiet watchfulness. He kept to himself. When in town for supplies, he moved with a purpose, his steps sure and unhurried. He would tie his buckskin gelding, Apollo, outside the general store, purchase his flour, salt, and coffee, and be gone. Sometimes, if the trail dust was too thick to ignore, he would stop at the saloon for a single whiskey, which he would drink standing alone at the end of the bar, his back to the wall. His presence was a weight in any room he entered, a quiet assertion of strength that needed no words. He was often seen down by the creek at the edge of town, shirtless, splashing the cold mountain water over his face and arms, washing away the grime of his work, his movements as methodical and precise as the ticking of a clock. He was a man who lived by routine, by the rising and setting of the sun, by the predictable needs of the horses he tamed. It was a life devoid of surprises, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Their worlds were not meant to intersect. He was the wild, open spaces. She was the confined, quiet room. But Redemption Creek was a small, hard place, and paths were bound to cross. It happened on a Tuesday evening, as Clara was walking back to the boarding house from her shop. The sun had set, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and purple. A man stepped out from the shadows of the alley beside the saloon, blocking her path. He was one of the miners, a burly man named Jedediah Stone, whose face was perpetually flushed with cheap whiskey. "Well now, look what we have here," he slurred, a smirk twisting his lips. "The little church mouse. Why you always hiding that pretty face, darlin'? Got something to be ashamed of?" Clara tried to step around him, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "Excuse me, sir." He moved with her, blocking her again. His smell, stale liquor and unwashed sweat, was suffocating. "No need to be shy, a woman like you, all alone. You must get lonely, I can be friendly." He reached for her veil. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She flinched back, stumbling off the boardwalk and into the dusty street. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Jedediah laughed. A coarse, ugly sound. "Feisty, are we? I like that." It was then that a horse and rider emerged from the dim light at the end of the street. It was Eli Cartwright. He reined in Apollo a few feet away, his expression unreadable in the gathering twilight. He did not speak. He simply sat there, a silent, imposing shape, his presence shifting the balance of the encounter. Jedediah glanced over his shoulder, his bravado faltering slightly under Eli's steady gaze. He grumbled something under his breath and then swaggered back toward the saloon. Clara stood frozen in the middle of the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dust settled around her feet. Eli dismounted in one fluid motion. He walked not to her, but to Apollo's side, and held out the reins. It was a silent offer of assistance, a way for her to escape without the indignity of having to walk past the saloon again. It was a gesture of profound and unexpected respect. For a moment, she was tempted, but she had been running for so long. She would not run now. She lifted her chin. "Thank you, but I can manage," she said, her voice regaining its strength. She turned and walked back toward the boarding house, her steps measured and deliberate, not looking back. Eli watched her go, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or admiration, in his dark eyes. He swung back into the saddle and rode out of town, the quiet clop of his horse's hooves fading into the night. The incident was not forgotten. A few days later, as Clara was leaving the general store with a parcel of cloth, Jedediah cornered her again, this time in the full light of day. He had been drinking again, and his mood was fouler. "Think you're too good for me, is that it?" he sneered, grabbing her arm. His grip was like a vice. "You and that horsebreaker. I'll show you what a real man is." Clara cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain and fear. She struggled, but he was too strong. The townsfolk on the street averted their eyes, pretending not to see, not wanting to get involved. But someone did see. Eli Cartwright was just leaving the blacksmith's, a new set of horseshoes in his hand. He saw the struggle, saw the fear on the visible side of Clara's face, and he did not hesitate. He moved with a speed that was startling in such a large, deliberate man. He did not shout a warning. He did not posture. He dropped the horseshoes with a heavy clang, took 2 long strides, and his fist connected with Jedediah's jaw. The sound was a sickening crack of bone on bone. Jedediah staggered back, surprise and pain warring on his face. Before he could recover, Eli hit him again, a hard, solid punch to the gut that doubled him over, gasping for air. Jedediah fell to his knees in the dust. Eli stood over him, his chest rising and falling, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Leave her be," he said, his voice low and dangerous, like the rumble of distant thunder. It was the quietest threat anyone in Redemption Creek had ever heard, and the most terrifying. Jedediah scrambled to his feet and scurried away, holding his jaw, his eyes wide with fear and humiliation. The street was silent. Everyone had stopped to watch. Eli ignored them. He bent down, picked up the horseshoes, and then turned to Clara. Her parcel had fallen, the cloth unspooling in the dust. He gathered it up, carefully brushing it off, and handed it back to her. He did not say a word. He simply nodded, his gaze meeting hers for a brief, intense moment, and then he turned and began to walk beside her. He walked her all the way to the door of her shop. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a shared space, a buffer against the prying eyes of the town. When they reached her door, she turned to him. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded again. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes did not slide away in discomfort or pity. They rested on her face with a quiet intensity. Then he turned and walked away, leading his horse toward the edge of town. After that, something shifted. Their orbits, once separate, now occasionally touched. They would pass on the street and exchange quiet greetings. "Morning, Miss Mayfield." "Mr. Cartwright." Small, insignificant words that began to build a fragile bridge between their two solitudes. She found herself looking for the sight of his buckskin horse tied up outside the general store. He found himself timing his trips to town for days when he knew she would be at her shop. She noticed the small things about him, the way he gentled a spooked horse with a low murmur and a steady hand, the way he always seemed to be watching, noticing everything, but saying little. There was a kindness in him, buried deep beneath the rough exterior, a kindness she recognized in the way he had offered her his horse, in the way he had walked her home in silence. He noticed things about her, too. He saw the strength in the straight line of her back, the determination in the set of her jaw, and he noticed that when she looked at him, she did not flinch or look away from the saber scar on his face. She met his gaze directly, her own gray eye clear and steady. She saw his wound, and she was not afraid. It was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition that they were both survivors, marked by a world that was careless with its cruelty. The autumn air grew crisp, and the leaves on the cottonwood trees by the creek turned a brilliant, fleeting gold. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The talk in town turned to the coming winter, to laying in supplies and banking fires high against the cold. Then the snow came. It began in the late afternoon, small, innocuous flakes drifting down from a sky the color of slate. By evening, it was a blizzard. A howling wind drove the snow sideways, piling it in great drifts against the buildings, erasing the street, the town, the entire world under a blanket of white. Clara was trapped. She had been working late in her shop, finishing a winter cloak for the doctor's wife, and had not realized the severity of the storm until she tried to open the door and found it blocked by a wall of snow. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the window frames and finding its way through every tiny crack in the walls. The little pot-bellied stove in the corner fought a losing battle against the encroaching cold. Her supply of firewood was meager, barely enough to last a few more hours. She sat huddled in her shawl, listening to the fury of the storm, feeling a familiar sense of isolation settle over her. She was alone, an island in a sea of white. The town, just a few yards away, felt as distant as the moon. A loud, solid knock on the door made her jump. It could not be. No one would be out in this. The wind must be playing tricks on her. The knock came again, firmer this time. Hesitantly, she went to the door and pushed against the snow. It gave way an inch, then two. Through the crack, she saw a figure, broad-shouldered and covered in snow. A silhouette against the swirling white. It was Eli Cartwright. He pushed the door open the rest of the way, the snow tumbling inside in a cold wave. He was carrying a large armload of split pine logs. Snow clung to his hat, his shoulders, and his eyelashes. "Figured you might be running low," he said, his voice a low rumble above the wind. He did not wait for an invitation, but stepped inside, bringing the scent of pine and cold, clean air with him. He stomped the snow from his boots and deposited the firewood in the box beside the stove. Clara could only stare. speechless. He had walked from the livery at the edge of town, through the heart of the blizzard, to bring her firewood. I do not know what to say," she stammered. "No need to say anything," he replied, his movements economical as he took off his hat and gloves. He crouched by the stove, opened its small iron door, and expertly added a few logs to the dwindling embers. The fire caught, hissing and popping, and a new wave of warmth began to push back the chill. "Let me make you some tea," Clara said, finding her voice. It was the only thing she could think to offer, a small gesture against his much larger one. He nodded and settled onto the small stool by the hearth, seeming to fill the small room with his quiet presence. Clara moved to the back of the shop where she kept a small kettle and a tin of tea leaves. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. The kettle sang, and she poured the steaming, fragrant liquid into 2 tin cups. She handed one to him. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second, and a jolt of warmth, entirely separate from the fire or the tea, passed between them. She sat in her own chair, wrapping her hands around the hot cup. Outside, the storm raged, a wild, untamed thing. But inside the small shop, a profound quiet settled. They did not speak. There were no words for what was passing between them. He watched the flames dance in the stove. She watched the firelight flicker across the rugged planes of his face, softening the hard lines, illuminating the kindness in his eyes. The silence stretched, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the rhythmic crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the unspoken acknowledgement of 2 lonely souls who had, by some strange grace, found a moment of shelter together. In the heart of the storm, something warm had begun to grow. The snow from the blizzard melted into a thick, clinging mud that swallowed the sounds of the town, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. In the quiet solitude of her shop, lit by the golden glow of a kerosene lamp, Clara Mayfield began to sew. The gratitude she felt toward Eli Cartwright was a living thing inside her, a warmth in the center of her chest that she had no words for. So she spoke with her hands. She had purchased a length of rough-spun cotton from the general store, the color of a winter sky just before dawn. It was a sturdy, honest fabric, meant for work, not for show. She imagined it on him, across his broad shoulders, a small comfort against the harshness of his life. For 3 nights, she worked. The steady rhythm of the treadle sewing machine was a calming presence, a friend in the lonely dark. She measured and cut with a precision that was second nature, the shears whispering through the cloth. Her stitches were small and straight, a line of perfect, unshakable integrity. This shirt would be strong. It would endure. When the main seams were done, she took up her needle and a spool of dark blue thread. This part was a secret, on the inside of the collar, where it would rest against the back of his neck. She embroidered a small, simple shape, a single hawk's feather. It was a symbol of the wildness and freedom she saw in him, a quiet acknowledgement of the spirit that lived behind his silent eyes. The work was intricate, a whisper of artistry hidden within the rugged utility of the garment. She did not know why she did it, only that it felt right. She wrapped the finished shirt in brown paper, tied it with twine, and left it for him at the livery stable, with a simple note that said only, "Thank you." She never expected to see him wear it. A man like him had no use for such things. The gesture was for her, a way to settle a debt that felt too large for words. As the days passed, the warmth of that night in the storm began to fade, replaced by the familiar chill of the town's suspicion. Her silence, once a source of mystery, now became a canvas onto which they painted their ugliest fears. The whispers that had followed her upon her arrival grew into full-throated gossip, each telling more monstrous than the last. They gathered in the saloon and over the mercantile counter, their voices low and venomous, weaving a story for the woman behind the veil. Some said she had been caught in a fire, a terrible accident, they would say, nodding with a show of pity that was really just a form of morbid curiosity. But the more creative storytellers, the ones who truly savored the taste of another's misfortune, went further. It was no accident. They insisted. Her husband, a jealous brute, had set the fire himself, leaving her disfigured as a punishment for some imagined sin. Her veil was a mark of his possession, a brand of her shame. And then there was the darkest rumor of all, the one whispered with a shiver of delicious horror. They said she had killed a man. Perhaps it was the jealous husband himself, struck down in a fit of passion. They pictured her with a knife or a pistol, her face contorted with rage. In this version of the story, the scars were not from a fire, but from the man's desperate, final struggle, his fingernails clawing at her face as she sent him to his maker. She was not a victim, but a monster. Clara heard the stories. She heard them in the sudden silences that fell when she entered the general store, in the way the other women pulled their children closer as she passed on the boardwalk. She saw them in the fearful, fascinated glances that followed her everywhere. Each lie was a fresh wound, another layer of shame to be piled onto a burden that was already too heavy to bear. But she did not weep or rage. She did not offer a single word of denial. Long ago, she had learned that the truth was a fragile thing, easily broken in the hands of cruel people. So she gathered the shame around her like a cloak, pulling it tight. Her silence became her armor, her veil a shield. She retreated deeper into herself, into the quiet, orderly world of her shop, where the only sound was the steady, comforting clatter of her sewing machine. Eli heard the gossip, too. He was standing at the end of the bar in the Redemption Creek saloon, the whiskey in his glass untouched, when Jedediah Stone, his jaw still tender from their last encounter, held court with a group of grimy prospectors. "I'm telling you, she's a black widow," Stone slurred, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Killed her husband and took off with his money. The sheriff back in Wichita is looking for her. The scars are from him fighting back before he died." A murmur of agreement went through the group. They leaned in closer, their faces alight with vicarious malice. Eli did not move, but something in the room shifted. The air grew thick and heavy. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes fixing on Jedediah Stone. He did not speak. He did not have to. His anger was a physical force, a quiet, dangerous pressure that silenced the room. It was not the hot, explosive anger of a barroom brawler, but something colder, deeper, and far more lethal. It was the anger of a man who had seen real violence and had no patience for the petty cruelties of lesser men. Under that silent, unblinking gaze, Jedediah's bravado shriveled. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting away. The other men fell silent, suddenly finding their boots very interesting. The bartender nervously wiped down a clean spot on the bar. The moment stretched, taut and brittle. Finally, Eli turned back to the bar, tossed back his whiskey in one smooth motion, placed the empty glass down with a quiet click, and walked out. He had not defended Clara's honor with words. He had simply made it clear that her name was not to be spoken with disrespect in his presence. The message was received. On Sunday, a fragile hope prompted Clara to do something she had not done since her arrival. She decided to attend church. It was a longing for a moment of peace, a desire to feel a part of something larger than her own small, painful world. She wore her best dress, a dark blue wool she had made herself, and her finest bonnet. She walked to the small, white-steepled building with her head held high, a prayer for acceptance in her heart. The prayer was not answered. As she stepped inside, the congregation turned as one to stare. The rustle of their whispers filled the sanctuary. Before she could find a seat, Deacon Miller, a man whose face was a permanent mask of pious disapproval, bustled down the aisle to intercept her. "Miss Mayfield," he said, his voice a low, unctuous murmur, "we are glad to have you join us. However, for the comfort of the other congregants, perhaps it would be best if you sat at the back." He indicated a single, hard bench in the rear of the church. set apart from the other pews, a place for outcasts and sinners. The humiliation was a physical blow. It struck the air from her lungs, leaving her dizzy and sick. The sea of faces before her swam in a blur of judgment. She saw no Christian charity here, only a cold, hard righteousness that had no room for the broken or the scarred. She wanted to turn and flee, but her pride would not let her. With a quiet nod, she walked to the lonely bench and sat, her back as straight as a steel rod. She did not hear the sermon. The preacher's words about forgiveness and redemption were a meaningless drone against the roaring in her ears. She felt the weight of every stare, the sting of every whispered comment. She was a spectacle, a cautionary tale for the good and the whole. Halfway through the final hymn, she could bear it no longer. She stood, her movement stiff and wooden, and walked out of the church. In her haste and shame, she left her worn boots by the door. She stepped out onto the porch and down into the snow-covered street, the icy cold a shocking, welcome jolt. She did not know where she was going. She just walked, away from the church, away from the town, her bare feet sinking into the cold, wet snow. The pain was sharp, but it was a clean pain, a physical agony that distracted from the deeper, dirtier wound that had been inflicted upon her soul. Tears streamed down the visible side of her face, freezing in the winter air. She had walked nearly a mile when she heard the sound of a horse behind her, its hoofbeats muffled by the fresh layer of snow. She did not turn. She kept walking, her gaze fixed on the endless, unforgiving white landscape ahead. The horse drew alongside her and stopped. It was Eli, astride Apollo. He looked down at her tear-streaked face and her bare, red feet. He did not speak for a long moment. Then, his voice low and rough, he asked the question that mattered more than any other. "You want me to take you back?" She stopped walking and looked up at him, her one visible eye raw with pain and defiance. Her voice, when it came, was a ragged whisper, the sound of something breaking. "You believe them too?" It was everything, every rumor, every stare, every moment of her tortured existence in this town was packed into that one question. He did not hesitate. He shook his head, a small, decisive movement. "I don't listen to fools." The words were simple, unadorned, but they landed in the desolate landscape of her heart like a seed. For the first time, someone had not judged her by her silence or her scars. He had judged the town and found it wanting. The tears that had been born of shame and humiliation now came from a different place, a place of profound and overwhelming relief. She stood there in the snow, weeping, as he watched over her, a silent, steadfast guardian. That evening, as she was soaking her numb feet in a basin of hot water in her small room at the boarding house, there was a knock on her door. It was Eli. He stood in the hallway, his hat in his hand, looking awkward and out of place. "I'm having supper at my place," he said, not quite meeting her eye. "Thought you might like to join me. Nothing fancy, just some stew." Clara was stunned into silence. No one had ever invited her anywhere. To be asked into a man's home, it was a gesture of trust, of acceptance, that she had not thought possible. She hesitated, a lifetime of fear and caution holding her back. But then she remembered his words in the snow. "I don't listen to fools." "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "I would like that very much." "I'll come for you in an hour," he said. And then he was gone. A nervous energy seized her. She wanted to contribute something, to bring a gift. She hurried down to Mrs. Gable's kitchen. The landlady watched with narrowed, suspicious eyes as Clara gathered flour, cornmeal, and buttermilk. Her hands, usually so steady in her work, trembled as she mixed the batter for cornbread. The simple, domestic act felt momentous, a step into a life she had long ago given up on. Eli's homestead was a small, solid-looking cabin nestled in a grove of pine trees a few miles out of town. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the deepening twilight. The inside was sparse and scrupulously clean. A narrow bed was made up with a single gray blanket, tucked in with military precision. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room. A few well-cared-for tools hung on the wall, and a poorly patched blue work shirt was draped over the back of a chair. She recognized her own handiwork in the hawk's feather embroidered on the inside of the collar. He had worn it. The sight sent a strange, fluttering warmth through her. The entire place spoke of a man who was self-sufficient, orderly, and deeply alone. The supper was quiet and comfortable. They ate the venison stew, which was rich and savory, and her cornbread, which was light and golden. They spoke little, but the silence was easy. A shared comfort against the cold night outside. He asked about her sewing, and she asked about his horses. They were small, safe topics. The first tentative steps onto the fragile bridge they were building between their 2 solitudes. After they had finished, she stood to help him clean up. "I can do that," he said. "I want to help," she insisted, gathering the tin plates. She stood beside him at the dry sink as he pumped water into a basin. The space was small, and their arms brushed as they worked. She was acutely aware of his closeness, of his solid, reassuring presence beside her. The simple act of washing dishes together felt more intimate than any conversation. It happened in an instant. As she turned from the sink, her hand still damp, she reached to move the heavy cast-iron skillet from the top of the hot stove. Her grip slipped, and the back of her hand brushed against the stove's searing hot surface. A sharp, involuntary cry of pain escaped her lips. The pain was immediate and intense, a white-hot fire lancing up her arm. "Clara!" Eli's voice was sharp with concern. He dropped the plate he was drying and reached for her injured hand. It was a purely instinctual reaction, an offer of aid and comfort. But for Clara, a man reaching for her in anger or in pain was a prelude to violence. Her body reacted before her mind could. She recoiled, a sudden, violent flinch, pulling away from him as if he were the one who had burned her. The movement was jerky and desperate, a panicked animal trying to escape a trap. As she stumbled back, the high collar of her dress caught and pulled away from her neck. For a single, stark moment, in the flickering lamplight, he saw it. Not the whole of her secret, but a glimpse, just below her collarbone, where the delicate skin should have been smooth and pale, was the edge of a scar. It was not a clean, silvery line like his own, but a roped, puckered ridge of flesh, the color a mottled, angry red, the texture like melted wax. She saw the direction of his gaze and immediately pulled her dress back into place, her good hand flying to her throat. Her face, the part that was visible, was a mask of horror and shame. The air in the small cabin grew thick and still, charged with a sudden, shocking revelation. The comforting quiet was shattered, replaced by a tense, ringing silence, the unspoken question of what he had seen hanging between them like a ghost. The ride back to the boarding house had been a blur of shame. Clara sat stiffly in Eli's wagon, the silence between them a roaring chasm. He had seen the edge of her ruin, the ugly truth that her veil and high-collared dresses were meant to conceal. In the flickering lamplight of his cabin, she had watched his eyes fix on that small, exposed patch of flesh. And though his expression had not changed, she had imagined the disgust, the pity, the confirmation of every dark rumor he had ever heard. He had not said a word about it, had simply handed her a clean cloth for her burned hand and driven her home. That silence was worse than any accusation. In the days that followed, Clara retreated into a prison of her own making. The walls were made of thread and cloth. The bars were the steady, driving rhythm of her sewing machine. She avoided him, and by avoiding him, she avoided the entire town. She no longer walked to the mercantile for her supplies, instead paying a young boy a penny to fetch what she needed. She took her meals in her room, a cold tray left outside her door by a disapproving Mrs. Gable. She worked from before the sun rose until long after it had set, the hiss of her lamp the only companion in the long, dark hours. The work was a drug. When her fingers were flying, when her mind was focused on the intricate path of a needle through fabric, she could almost forget the look in his eyes. Almost. She punished herself with work, pushing through the ache in her back and the burn in her eyes. She mended rips and tears with a ferocity that bordered on rage, as if by fixing the torn garments of others, she could somehow stitch together the tattered pieces of her own life. She convinced herself that what she had felt in his cabin, that flicker of warmth, of acceptance, had been a figment of her own lonely imagination. He was like all the others. He had seen her damage, and now he would stay away. The thought was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. A week after the disastrous supper, she heard a heavy, familiar footstep on the boardwalk outside her shop. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. She froze, her hand hovering over the fabric she was cutting. The door opened, and he was there, filling the frame, bringing the sharp, clean scent of the outdoors with him. Eli Cartwright stood in her doorway, his hat in his hands. He looked just as he always did, solid, quiet, his face an unreadable mask. Clara's hands began to tremble. This was it. He had come to say something, to ask the question that she could not bear to answer. She braced herself for the blow. But he did not speak of that night. He did not mention her hand, or the scar. His gaze was steady and direct, and it held no pity. He looked around the shop, at the neat stacks of fabric and the spools of thread arranged by color on their shelves. "You do good work," he said, his voice a low rumble. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He took a step into the room. "I have a niece, back in Laramie. She's turning 12 next month." He paused, as if the words were unfamiliar shapes in his mouth. "I was hoping you could make her a shirt, a birthday gift." Clara stared at him. Of all the things she had expected, this was not it. He was giving her work. He was treating her like the town seamstress, like a normal person. He was deliberately, pointedly, ignoring the chasm that had opened between them. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected grace that it left her breathless. "Something pretty," he continued, looking down at his own dusty boots. "She likes blue." Clara finally found her voice. "Yes, of course. Mr. Cartwright, I can do that." "I'll pay double your usual rate," he said quickly, as if to ward off any argument. "For the trouble." She knew it was not for the trouble. It was his way of helping, his way of telling her that he was still on her side. It was charity disguised as commerce, a kindness so subtle she could almost pretend it was not there. "That will not be necessary," she said softly. "I will charge you the proper price." A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, passed through his eyes. He nodded. "When you're done, leave it at the livery. I'll be back in town in a fortnight." And then he was gone. Clara sank into her chair, the shears falling from her nerveless fingers. He had not looked away, not in the way that mattered. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and he had come back, not with questions or with pity, but with a quiet offer of normalcy. A shirt for his niece, a simple, ordinary request that felt like a lifeline. The arrival of the bathing tent was the talk of Redemption Creek for a week. It had been ordered by the owner of the general store, a shrewd man who saw an opportunity in the town's growing population of transient miners and ranch hands. It was a simple affair, a large, circular tent of heavy canvas, erected on a wooden platform behind the livery stable. Inside, a small stove heated a large metal drum of water, which could then be ladled into a wooden tub. For 2 bits, a man could have a hot bath and scrub away a month's worth of trail dust and grime. It was a place of men, rough, loud men who came and went, their voices coarse, their bodies hard from labor. No respectable woman in town would dream of going near it. It was too public, too close to the stables, too vulnerable. But Clara was not a respectable woman, not in their eyes, and she was tired of the small, cold tub in her boarding house room, of water that was lukewarm at best. The thought of a real bath, of sinking into steaming hot water until her bones ached with the pleasure of it, was a temptation she could not resist. So she began to use it. She would go in the early morning, just as the sun was rising, when the town was still quiet and the tent was most likely to be empty. She would carry her towels and soap in a small basket, her steps quick and purposeful, her gaze fixed straight ahead, ignoring the few curious stares she received. Inside the tent, she would bar the flap and, in the steamy, private warmth, she would finally feel clean. It was a small act of rebellion, a claiming of a space, a brief respite from a world that offered her so little comfort. One morning, she arrived later than usual. The sun was already well above the mountains, and the town was beginning to stir. She pushed open the canvas flap of the tent and stopped dead. He was there. Eli Cartwright stood with his back to her, shirtless. He was bent over the tub, splashing water over his face and arms. The early morning light slanted through the opening at the top of the tent, illuminating the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders, the sun-darkened skin slick with water. A long, puckered scar ran along his ribs on one side, a pale track on his tanned skin. He was washing away the dust of the high country, and he had not heard her enter. Clara's first instinct was to flee, to turn and run before he saw her, before this accidental, intimate encounter could add another layer of awkwardness between them. Her hand was already pulling back the flap when she stopped. Something inside her, a voice she had not heard in years, a voice of fierce and weary defiance, spoke. No more running. She let the flap fall shut. The soft thud made him turn. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw her standing there, her basket clutched in her hands, her face a mixture of fear and resolve. He immediately reached for his shirt, which was hanging on a peg. "Miss Mayfield, I apologize. I thought I was alone." "Do not," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It stopped him, his hand hovering over the shirt. She took a slow, deliberate step into the center of the tent. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and, in some secret part of her soul, craving. The moment of truth. With hands that trembled so badly she could barely control them, she reached up and untied the ribbons of her bonnet. She set it aside. Then, her eyes never leaving his, she slowly, carefully, unpinned her veil. She let it fall to the floor, a soft pool of lace at her feet. The right side of her face was now fully exposed in the clear morning light. It was, as she knew too well, a landscape of ruin. The skin was a tapestry of scars, tight and shiny in some places, deeply grooved in others. The burn had pulled the corner of her eye down slightly, giving her a permanent expression of sorrow. Her eyebrow was gone, replaced by a slick patch of skin. She saw a flicker in his eyes, not of disgust, but of shock, of a pain that mirrored her own. But he did not look away. His gaze remained steady, holding hers. "Don't look away," she whispered, the words a command and a plea. He did not. That was not enough. He had to know it all. He had to see the whole, ugly truth. Her trembling fingers went to the top button of her high-collared dress, one by one. She unfastened them. The dress was plain, functional, but now it felt like the last wall of a fortress that she was tearing down with her own hands. She pushed the fabric aside, pulling the neckline down to her shoulder, exposing the skin of her collarbone, her shoulder, and the top of her chest. The damage was far worse there. The fire had feasted on her. A thick, ropey network of scars covered her. Crawling down her ribs and across her hip, the skin was mottled, puckered, a permanent record of an agony she could barely remember without screaming. She stood before him, stripped bare, not of her clothes, but of her secrets. She was offering him her shame, her ugliness, her entire broken self. She waited for the flinch, for the look of horror, for the pity that would be worse than any revulsion. He just stood there, his own scars bathed in the same morning light. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a profound and terrible sadness. He saw not a monster, but a woman who had been through an inferno. He took a slow breath. "You lived through hell," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. The simple, profound validation of her survival broke something inside her. A single tear traced a path down her good cheek, for the first time since it had happened. She spoke the truth aloud. The words came out in a torrent, a poison that had been burning inside her for years. "I was 18, she began, her voice a raw, broken thing. "I was married. I wanted to leave him. He told me that if he could not have me, no one would—" She choked on a sob, but forced herself to continue. "He waited until I was asleep. He poured lamp oil all over the bed, all over me, and then he lit a match." She did not tell him about the screaming, about the smell of her own burning flesh, about the endless pain. She did not have to. He could see it, written on her skin. "He died in the fire," she finished, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "It started with the bed, but it took the whole house. He was trapped in the other room. They said I was lucky to be alive." She stood there, empty and shaking. The story finally told. She had shown him the worst of her, and he was still there. He had not looked away. That night, for the first time in years, Clara dreamed of the fire, but the dream was different. She was in the burning bed, the flames licking at her, the smoke choking her. But this time, she was not alone. A pair of strong arms reached through the inferno, lifted her, and carried her out into the cool, clean air. She could not see the face of her rescuer, but she knew his quiet strength. She woke up in the dark of her small room, her face wet with tears. But they were not tears of terror. They were tears of release. The next day, Eli rode into town. He did not come to her shop. He went to the mercantile, and then he appeared at the door of her boarding house. He carried a small crate. He did not ask to come in, but simply handed it to her in the doorway. "For you," he said gruffly. Inside the crate, nestled in straw, was a jar of golden honey, a large piece of smoked jerky, and a brand new pair of sturdy leather boots, the kind a person would wear for a long journey. She looked from the practical, thoughtful gifts to his face. There were no words for what she was feeling. It was too large, too overwhelming. It was the shock of being cared for, of being seen. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, to her own astonishment, she burst into tears. She stood in the doorway of the respectable boarding house and wept, not with shame or with fear, but with the painful, exquisite relief of a soul that had, after a long and terrible winter, finally been touched by grace. The confession in the bathing tent did not tear them apart. It bound them together. The ugly truth, once spoken, lost its power to haunt the space between them. A quiet understanding bloomed in its place, a fragile and tender thing that they nurtured in the small, shared moments that began to define their days. The town, with its narrow eyes and venomous whispers, faded to the periphery. Their world shrank to the size of the path they walked together. They began to spend their time in a language of comfortable silence and simple, shared tasks, some afternoons. Eli would ride to her shop, and they would walk along the creek, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravelly bank and the rush of the cold, clear water. He would point out the tracks of a deer or the high, circling flight of a hawk, and she would listen, her face turned toward him, the veil forgotten between them. Other days, he would take her out to his homestead. She would sit on his porch, mending his work clothes with her neat, precise stitches, while he worked in the corral, his low, calm voice gentling a nervous colt. He taught her how to check a fence line for breaks, his large, calloused hands guiding hers as she stretched the wire taut. She, in turn, showed him how to bake biscuits that were light and fluffy, not the hard, dense pucks he was used to. They were small offerings, simple acts of care that, woven together, created a fabric of profound intimacy. They were two solitary people learning the forgotten grammar of companionship. In a world that was brutal and loud, they had found a small pocket of peace. But their peace was a quiet affront to the town of Redemption Creek. Gossip, having no new scandals to feed on, turned its hungry gaze back to the seamstress and the horsebreaker. The sight of them together, walking or talking, was a source of endless speculation. The women who had once pitied Clara now envied her the quiet devotion of a man like Eli Cartwright. The men who had dismissed her as damaged goods now saw her as a prize that had been claimed by another. Their shared solitude was interpreted as a secret, and the town, in its collective, self-righteous mind, decided it knew the nature of that secret. The whispers solidified into a hard, ugly word. They said she was keeping the cowboy. The phrase was tossed around the saloon with a wink and a nudge, and murmured over fences with a shake of the head. It implied a relationship of convenience and carnality, stripping away the quiet dignity of what was growing between them and replacing it with something cheap and sordid. It was Mrs. Gable, the landlady, who brought the verdict to Clara's door. She stood in the doorway of Clara's small room, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mask of pinched morality. "Miss Mayfield," she began, her voice as crisp and cold as a winter morning, "I run a respectable house. I will not have this kind of arrangement under my roof." Clara, who was packing away the finished shirt for Eli's niece, looked up, confused. "I do not understand." "Oh, I think you do." Mrs. Gable sniffed. "The whole town is talking. You and that Cartwright man, it is not proper. A single woman entertaining a man at his homestead, taking long, unchaperoned walks. It gives my boarding house a bad name. I must ask you to find other lodgings." She said it with a certain grim satisfaction, the righteous pleasure of casting out a sinner. The demand was not a surprise. Not really. Clara had been braced for the town's cruelty for so long that its arrival was almost a relief. Still, the injustice of it stung. She had done nothing wrong, had sought only a small measure of kindness in a world that had shown her so little. She looked at the landlady, at her hard, unforgiving eyes, and she felt not shame, but a surge of weary anger. "I will be gone by the end of the week," Clara said, her voice steady. She told Eli that evening, as they sat by the creek, watching the sun set behind the mountains. She did not cry. She stated it as a simple, unavoidable fact. He listened without speaking, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The silence stretched, and for a moment, she was afraid. She had become a liability, a burden. Perhaps now he would see that she was more trouble than she was worth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly. "There's an old trapper's shack up north of my place, in the woods. It's been empty for years. It's not much, but it's solid. We can make it livable." He had not said you. He had said we. The word hung in the air between them, a promise and a declaration. He was not abandoning her. He was building her a new home. The shack was small and rough, made of logs chinked with mud and moss. It had a stone fireplace, a single room, and a dirt floor. It smelled of damp earth and old wood smoke. To Clara, it looked like a palace. It was a place that belonged to no one, a place where the town's judgment could not reach her. For the next 3 days, they worked. Eli, with his quiet competence, seemed to know how to do everything. He rehung the heavy wooden door so it swung true on its leather hinges. He climbed onto the roof and patched the shingles, his movements sure and steady. He cleared the chimney of an old bird's nest, his face emerging black with soot, but his eyes smiling. Clara worked alongside him. She swept the dirt floor until it was hard-packed and clean. She mixed mud and grass and chinked the gaps between the logs, her small hands pushing the mixture into the cracks with a determined focus. She washed the single and grimy window until the late afternoon sun streamed through, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the air. Eli carried her few belongings from the boarding house on his wagon. Her small carpet bag, her basket of sewing notions, and the most precious thing she owned, her sewing machine. He lifted the heavy iron machine as if it were a child, setting it carefully in the corner of the cabin that she had designated as her workspace. As he brought in the last of her things, a small box of books, he stopped and looked at her. She stood in the center of the small, rustic room, her dress smudged with dirt, her hands raw from her work, and she was smiling. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile, a radiant, unguarded expression that lit up her entire face. That night, they ate supper sitting on the floor in front of the fireplace. Eli had repaired the chimney, and the fire he built drew perfectly, casting a warm, flickering glow over the rough-hewn walls. They ate beans and bacon from tin plates, the silence comfortable and complete. They had built this place together. It was theirs. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, a new kind of awareness settled between them. The day's shared labor had forged a new level of intimacy, a physical partnership that now hummed in the quiet air of the cabin. Clara felt it as a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked at him, at his strong profile illuminated by the flames, at the way the light caught the silver in his hair at his temples. She saw not just a kind man, but a man she had come to depend on, to trust, to care for. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed for a moment under her touch, and then relaxed. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes questioning. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft, hesitant kiss at first, a question asked without words. He did not move, did not respond, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought she had made a terrible mistake. But then he made a low sound in his throat, and his hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. He kissed her back, and the kiss deepened, no longer hesitant, but filled with a world of unspoken longing. It was a slow, searing kiss that tasted of wood smoke and coffee, and a loneliness so profound it ached. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He looked at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she had never seen before. His hand, which was still cradling her head, moved, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw on her unscarred side. Then, with an infinite tenderness, his fingers moved to the other side of her face. He touched her scars. His touch was not hesitant or clinical. It was a caress, a slow, deliberate exploration. He traced the raised, ropey flesh, his calloused fingertips impossibly gentle. He was not mapping her damage. He was learning the geography of her survival. He was touching her as if these marks were not a source of shame, but a testament to her strength, the hard-won proof that she was still here. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She leaned into his touch, and for the first time in her life, she felt not ugly, but beautiful. Their peace was a fragile bubble, and it was destined to burst. The outside world came for them a week later, in the form of a man who rode into Redemption Creek on a lathered horse, his face a mask of rage. His name was Caleb Stone, and he was the brother of Clara's dead husband. He was a hard, greasy man with small, cruel eyes and a mouth that was perpetually twisted in a sneer. He had heard a rumor from a traveling merchant, a rumor that the woman who had, in his mind, murdered his brother was not only alive, but living freely in a small town in the territories. He had come for vengeance. He found her in the general store, where she had gone for a spool of thread. He cornered her between the pickle barrel and a stack of flour sacks, his presence blocking out the light from the door. "I knew I'd find you, you murdering witch!" he spat, his voice loud and raw. Clara froze, the blood draining from her face. It was a ghost from her past, a nightmare made real. "You left my brother to burn in that house," Caleb shouted, jabbing a finger at her. The whole store had gone silent. Everyone was watching. You set that fire, and you ran. You should be in jail, or better yet, swinging from a rope." "That is not what happened," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Liar," he roared. "You think you can hide out here? I'll see you hang for what you did. I swear it on my brother's grave." She fled, dropping her basket, the spool of thread rolling away under a counter. She ran out into the street, his hateful words following her. She did not stop until she reached the safety of her cabin. The door barred, her body shaking with a terror she had not felt in years. The next day, the sheriff came to call. Sheriff Brody was a decent man, but a man who valued a quiet town above all else. He stood at her door, his hat in his hands, his face etched with weary resignation. "Miss Mayfield," he began, not meeting her eye. "This man, Caleb Stone, he's been talking, stirring up trouble. He's telling folks you're a wanted fugitive." "It is not true," Clara said, her voice small. The sheriff sighed. "Truth is a funny thing in a town like this. Ma'am, it's whatever the loudest voice says it is, and right now, his is the loudest. Folks are getting nervous. They don't like this kind of trouble. They're pressuring me to do something." "What can you do? I have broken no law." "Maybe not," he conceded. "But I can't protect you, not really. If Mr. Stone decides to press charges, I'll have to hold you. And even if he doesn't, this town has turned on you. It's not safe for you here anymore. I'm asking you, for your own good, to move on." It was the final betrayal. The law, which should have been her shield, was telling her to run. The weight of it all, the years of shame, the constant struggle, the brief, beautiful glimpse of peace that was now being ripped away, was too much. The strength that had carried her for so long finally crumbled. When Eli returned that evening, he found her sitting on the floor, her bags packed, her face a mask of utter desolation. She broke down in his arms, the sobs racking her small frame. "I have to leave," she wept, her voice muffled against his chest. "I cannot fight anymore. Eli, I am so tired of fighting. I will just go north. Find somewhere else, somewhere they do not know me." He held her, his arms a circle of solid strength around her. He let her cry until the storm had passed, until her sobs quieted into shuddering breaths. He stroked her hair, his hand gentle and steady. When she was quiet, he tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were fierce, his voice low and certain. "Then I'm going with you," he said. "If you leave, we leave together." The words were a vow, a promise that rooted her to the spot. She was not alone in this. She would never be alone again. A fragile, battered hope began to flicker back to life in her chest. That night, she slept more soundly than she had in days, curled against his side, his steady breathing a lullaby. They would leave in the morning. They would go north, and they would be free. But the world was not done with them yet. In the deep, dark hours just before dawn, they were woken by a sound, a strange, hungry crackling, and a smell, the smell of smoke. Eli was on his feet in an instant. He threw open the cabin door, and a wall of heat and orange light met them. The front of the cabin was on fire. Flames were licking up the dry logs, greedily consuming the small sanctuary they had built. "The back window!" Eli yelled, grabbing her arm. He half dragged her to the single window at the back of the cabin. He smashed the glass with his fist, heedless of the cuts, and pushed her through the opening. She fell onto the cold, damp ground outside. He followed a second later, his face grim, his knuckles bleeding. They stood in the cold darkness of the woods and watched their home burn. The fire was swift and merciless. The roof collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Everything was gone. Her clothes, the food they had stored, the books, the new boots he had given her, and in the corner, her sewing machine, the symbol of her trade, her independence, was being twisted into a black, unrecognizable shape by the inferno. They watched until there was nothing left but the charred, skeletal frame of the cabin, a black wound against the pale light of the rising sun. She did not cry. She simply stood beside him, his arm around her shoulders, and stared at the ashes of her life. The fire had taken everything from her. Everything, except the man standing beside her. They did not run far. Eli knew the woods and the mountains that surrounded Redemption Creek better than any man alive. He led them to a sheltered hollow, a place where a granite overhang created a shallow cave, protected from the wind and hidden from the main trail by a thick stand of aspens. This became their home. They had nothing: the clothes on their backs, the knife on Eli's belt, and his revolver, which he had managed to grab before they fled the burning cabin. Everything else was ash. But in the stark, elemental world of the wilderness, they found a strange and unexpected freedom. The loss of everything meant they had nothing left to lose. Their days fell into a simple, primal rhythm. Eli taught Clara the ways of the woods. He showed her how to set a snare for rabbits, how to find clean water, how to read the clouds for a coming storm. He was a patient teacher, his hands guiding hers, his voice a low, steady murmur against the backdrop of the whispering aspens. Clara, in turn, brought a measure of domesticity to their harsh existence. She discovered a patch of wild onions and dug them up with a sharpened stick, adding a savory bite to their roasted rabbit. She took the gritty, bitter coffee that was all they had and showed Eli how to boil it with a piece of charred wood to settle the grounds, making it almost palatable. And she took over the cooking of their meager meals, her hands, once accustomed to the delicate art of needlepoint, now proving just as adept at kneading a serviceable dough from flour and water. One evening, as she was baking biscuits on a flat rock propped over the fire, Eli watched her, a small, bemused smile playing on his lips. "My biscuits always come out hard enough to break a tooth on," he admitted. "You use too much flour," she said, not looking up from her task. "And your hands are too warm. You have to be quick and light," she demonstrated, her fingers deftly working the dough. And the resulting biscuits were a revelation, fluffy on the inside, with a crisp, golden crust. It was a small, simple triumph, but in their stripped-down world, it felt like a feast. The next day, it was his turn to be the teacher. He took out his revolver, the metal dark and heavy. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice serious. "If I am not here, you need to be able to protect yourself." The weight of the gun in her hands was terrifying. It was a tool of death, a symbol of the violence that had shattered her life. But as she looked at Eli's steady, determined face, she knew he was right. She could not afford to be helpless. He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. The first time she fired it, the sound was a deafening crack that echoed through the woods, and the kick of the gun bruised her shoulder. The smell of gunpowder was acrid and sharp, but she did not drop it. She fired again and again, until she could hit the pine cone he had set on a distant stump. A grim satisfaction settled in her. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor. In the quiet evenings, they would sit by the fire, the vast, star-dusted sky their only roof, the world of Redemption Creek, with its judgments and its cruelty, felt 1,000,000 miles away. Here, under the silent watch of the mountains, Clara felt a part of herself unfurling, a part that had been clenched tight in fear for years. A quiet belief began to take root in her, a belief in a future. It was not a future she had ever imagined, safe, respectable, settled, but something wilder, and perhaps more true, a future that was free. One night, as the fire popped and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the rock face behind them, she finally asked the question that had been hovering on her lips for weeks. She looked at him, at the old saber scar by his eye and the long, puckered line along his ribs, which she had glimpsed that morning in the bathing tent. "Eli," she began, her voice soft, "you told me I lived through hell. "Do you have scars, too? Not just the ones on the outside?" He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. The firelight carved deep lines into his face, making him look older, wearier. She thought for a moment that he would not answer, that she had pushed too far into the walled-off fortress of his soul. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough, the words pulled from a place of deep, old pain. "The war," he said. "It leaves scars on everyone it touches." He shifted, turning to look at her, his eyes dark with memory. "I had a brother, younger than me. His name was Samuel. He was full of life, always laughing. He followed me when I enlisted. Said he had to look after his big brother." A sad, bitter smile touched Eli's lips. "We were at Cold Harbor. It was a slaughter. Just waves of men running into a wall of lead. I saw him go down. I ran to him, right in the middle of it all. I did not even think. I just ran." He paused, his throat working. Clara sat perfectly still, her heart aching for him. "He'd been hit in the chest. There was nothing to be done. I held him. The field smelled of gunpowder and blood and mud." He looked up at me, and he tried to smile, and then his eyes just went vacant. He died right there, in my arms, and a part of me died with him. He touched the scar on his side. I got this a few minutes later, a piece of shrapnel. I barely felt it. The wound inside was so much worse. That is the wound that never heals, the wound in the soul." He fell silent, the story told. He had offered her his deepest pain, his most profound loss. He had trusted her with the ghost that haunted him. Clara reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply sat with him in his grief, her presence a silent testament that he was no longer alone with his ghosts. Later that night, as they lay on their bed of pine boughs, looking up at the river of stars that flowed across the black sky, a new and powerful current flowed between them. It was a culmination of everything: the shared dangers, the quiet confessions, the profound acceptance of each other's broken places. He turned to her, his hand gently cupping her face. The fire had burned down to embers, and in the soft, silvery starlight, her scars were just shadows, faint lines on her skin. He leaned in and kissed her, and this kiss was different from the first. It was not a question, but an answer. It was a slow, deep, and healing kiss, a conversation without words. They made love beneath the stars. It was an act of profound tenderness and fierce, desperate intensity. For Clara, it was a reclaiming of her own body, a place that had been a source of pain and shame for so long. His touch was not greedy or rough. It was a form of worship. He kissed her scars, her face, her shoulders, her ribs, as if he were memorizing a sacred text. He whispered her name like a prayer. He erased the ghosts of the past with the gentle, insistent pressure of his hands, his lips, his body. And as they lay tangled together, their breath mingling in the cold night air, he leaned close to her ear and whispered the words she had never thought she would hear, the words she had never dared to believe. "You are beautiful," he said, and for the first time in a lifetime of shame, she believed it. Their idyll was shattered 3 days later. The danger, when it came fast and without warning. They were preparing their morning meal when they smelled it. The sharp, unmistakable scent of smoke, but not from their own small fire. It was a bigger fire, a hungrier fire, and it was close. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his hand on his revolver. He climbed the rocks above their camp and peered through the trees. Down in the valley below, less than a half a mile away, a barn on an abandoned homestead was ablaze, a roaring inferno sending a pillar of black smoke into the clear morning sky. And there, silhouetted against the flames, were 3 riders. "It is him," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he slid back down into the hollow. "Stone, and he has friends. He is trying to smoke us out. trying to drive us into the open. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Clara. Caleb Stone had not given up. He had come back, and he had brought allies.
"What do we do?"
she whispered. "We move," Eli said, his mind already working. "We head for the high country. There are caves, box canyons, places to hide, places to make a stand." They moved quickly, gathering their few possessions, but they were too late. As they were about to leave the shelter of the hollow, a voice echoed through the trees. "Nowhere to run! Horsebreaker! We know you are in there. Send out the murdering witch, and we might let you live." They were trapped. The three men were spread out, circling their position. Clara could see them now, moving through the trees like wolves, their rifles glinting in the sun. "Stay behind this rock," Eli commanded, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the tension that coiled in his body. "And do not move, no matter what you hear." He handed her the revolver. "If they get past me," he said, his eyes meeting hers, dark and intense. "You use this. Do you understand?" She nodded, her hand closing around the cold, heavy weight of the gun. The world exploded in a flash of sound and pain. A rifle shot cracked from the trees, and the rock beside Eli's head splintered, sending shards of granite flying. He fired back, a single, deliberate shot. A cry of pain answered from the woods. The fight was a blur of chaos. Gunshots echoed through the hollow, the sound deafening. Smoke from the black powder filled the air, stinging Clara's eyes and throat. Eli moved with a deadly grace, using the rocks for cover, firing with an economy of motion that spoke of long and bitter experience. He was no longer the quiet horsebreaker. He was the cavalryman, the soldier, a man fighting for his life and for hers. He was protecting her. He was deliberately keeping his body between her and the direction of the gunfire. And then it happened. He leaned out from behind the rock to fire, and one of Stone's men, hidden on a ridge above them, got a clear shot. Clara saw it all in sickening slow motion. The puff of smoke from the rifle on the ridge. Eli's body jerking. A cry of pain ripped from his throat. He staggered back, his hand flying to his leg, and fell to the ground. "Eli!" she screamed. Ignoring his order, she scrambled to his side. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the thigh of his trousers. Blood, thick and shockingly red, was pumping from the wound. He tried to get up, his face pale and twisted in pain, but his leg would not hold him. Another shot whizzed past her head. They were exposed, vulnerable. "The cave!" he gasped, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Get me to the cave." Somehow, she found the strength. She wrapped his arm around her shoulders and half dragged, half carried him to the shallow cave at the back of the hollow. He collapsed onto the cold stone floor, a low groan escaping his lips. Outside, the shooting stopped. "They are coming," he whispered, his breathing ragged. Clara looked at his leg. The wound was bad, terrifyingly bad. He was losing too much blood. He needed a doctor. He needed help, and the only help was back in Redemption Creek. She made a decision. She tore a long strip from the hem of her dress and wrapped it tightly around his thigh, creating a desperate tourniquet. "I am going for help," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "No," he said, grabbing her arm. "It is too dangerous. They are out there."
"They will kill you if I stay,"
she said, her eyes meeting his. "I am not going to let you die." She took his horse, Apollo, who had been tethered in a thicket nearby. As she swung herself into the saddle, a new and terrible thought struck her. She rode back to the cave entrance.
"Eli,"
she said, her voice urgent. "The men who shunned me, the sheriff who told me to leave, they will not help you just because I ask." He was fading, his eyelids fluttering, but he heard her. "Then make them," he whispered. "Show them your fire, Clara." She turned the horse and rode. She did not take the safe, hidden trails. She rode straight and hard, down the main path, toward the town that had cast her out. She was no longer running from her past. She was riding straight into it, a wild creature, her dress torn, her face streaked with dirt and his blood, her eyes blazing with a fire that would make the whole world burn before she would let him die. She was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The townspeople of Redemption Creek had never truly seen her before. They were about to... She galloped into town like a fury, Apollo's hooves thundering on the hard-packed earth. People scattered before her. She reined the horse to a skidding stop in front of the sheriff's office, her body trembling, her voice a raw, frantic cry. "Sheriff Brody, get your men! Eli Cartwright has been shot!" A crowd gathered, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. They saw not the quiet, veiled seamstress, but a woman transformed, her scars a testament to a past they could not imagine, her face a mask of desperate courage. They saw the blood on her clothes, the wildness in her eyes, and for the first time, they saw her fire. And in that moment, they knew that every ugly rumor, every cruel whisper, had been a lie. They had been wrong, terribly wrong. The sheriff emerged from his office, his face pale. He looked at Clara, at the irrefutable proof of violence written all over her, and a deep shame settled in his eyes. He had told this woman to leave, had offered her no protection. Now, she had returned, not as a victim, but as a warrior, demanding the justice he had denied her. Shamed into action, he did not hesitate. "Form a posse," he bellowed. "Johnson, Miller, get your rifles. We have men to find." Clara did not wait. She turned Apollo and galloped back toward the woods, the sheriff and a small group of hastily deputized townsmen riding hard behind her. She led them through the trees, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Please be alive, please be alive." She led them to the hollow. The air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder. They found one of Stone's men dead, a single, clean shot to the chest. The other two, including Caleb, were gone. Clara slid from the saddle and ran to the cave. She knelt at the entrance, her breath catching in her throat. Eli lay where she had left him, a still, silent figure on the cold stone floor. He was unconscious, his face pale and slick with fever, his breathing shallow. The makeshift bandage on his leg was soaked through with blood. He was alive, but barely. The world returned to Eli in fragments of pain and fevered dreams. He was trapped in the clamor of battle, the air thick with the screams of dying men and the ghost of his brother's last breath. Then the chaos would recede, replaced by the cool, gentle touch of a hand on his forehead and a soft voice that pulled him back from the edge of the abyss. It was Clara's voice, a steady anchor in a raging sea. He was in the doctor's house, in a small, clean room that smelled of carbolic acid and lavender. Dr. Miller, a man of few words and competent hands, had dug the bullet from his thigh, a ragged piece of lead that had shattered bone and torn through muscle. For days, Eli hovered in the twilight between life and death. The fever burned through him, and the wound throbbed with a relentless, fiery agony. Through it all, Clara was there. She became a creature of quiet, fierce devotion. She did not sleep, except for brief moments in a chair by his bedside. She bathed his face with cool water, spooned thin broth between his chapped lips, and changed the bandages on his leg with a steady hand that never flinched from the raw, angry wound. She was a constant, calming presence. Her focus narrowed to the single, all-important task of keeping him tethered to the world. She willed him to live, and her will was a force of nature. News of the shootout and Eli's injury spread through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. The story of Clara's frantic ride into town, bloody and wild, had transformed her in their eyes. She was no longer the mysterious, damaged woman to be whispered about and shunned. She was a figure of astonishing courage, a woman who had faced down death to save the man she loved. The town, in its slow, collective way, began to feel the heavy weight of its own shame. The apologies began as a trickle. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile was the first. She appeared at the doctor's back door one morning with a basket containing a fresh-baked loaf of bread, a jar of apple butter, and a small block of cheese. She thrust it into Clara's hands, mumbled something about being sorry for the trouble, and fled before Clara could respond. The next day, 2 of the ranchers' wives brought a thick, warm quilt. They spoke of the coming cold, but their eyes spoke of a deeper regret. Soon, it became a steady stream. A miner left a pouch of coffee on the porch. The blacksmith's son brought a bucket of fresh milk. They were clumsy, awkward offerings. The currency of a community that did not know how to say it was sorry. Clara accepted each gift with a quiet, weary grace. There was no triumph in her, no satisfaction in their repentance. She was too tired, too focused on the pale, still man in the bed, to have room for any other emotion. Sheriff Brody, driven by a newfound and uncomfortable sense of duty, had ridden out with his posse and captured Caleb Stone and his remaining accomplice in a saloon 20 miles north. They were brought back in irons and locked in the town's small, stuffy jail to await the circuit judge, who was due to arrive in a fortnight. When the day of the trial came, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. The courtroom was the largest room in the town hall, but it was still small, and it was packed to the rafters. People stood 3 deep along the back wall, their faces a mixture of grim curiosity and sober respect. Caleb Stone sat beside his lawyer, his face sullen and bruised, his eyes radiating a venomous hatred. Clara walked into that courtroom, and a hush fell over the crowd. She wore a simple gray dress, the one she had arrived in town with, mended and clean. She wore no bonnet, no veil. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and her face, with its landscape of scars, was open to the world. She did not hide, she did not flinch. She walked with her head held high, a queen entering her court. And in the front row, a space cleared for him as if by silent, communal agreement, sat Eli. He was pale and thin, and he leaned heavily on a rough-hewn wooden cane. But he was there. He had insisted. His eyes, clear now of fever, followed her, a steady, unwavering source of strength. When Clara was called to the stand, the silence in the room was absolute. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore her oath, her voice quiet but clear. The prosecutor, a young, earnest man from Cheyenne, began his questioning gently, asking her to recount the events that had led to the fire in her cabin and the subsequent gunfight. She answered his questions with a simple, unadorned honesty. But it was the defense attorney, a slick, oily man hired by Stone's family, who brought the real trial. He forced her to speak of her marriage, of her husband's death, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Is it not true, Mrs. Mayfield," he sneered, "that you and your late husband had a volatile relationship, that you often fought?"
My husband was a violent man,
Clara replied, her voice steady. "And is it not true that on the night of the fire, you had threatened to leave him, to take what you considered your share of his property?"
I had told him I was leaving,
she said. There was no property to take. The lawyer paced before her, a predator circling its prey. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell me, Mrs. Mayfield, how is it that a man burns to death in his own home, while his wife, who was sleeping in the very same house, escapes with nothing more than a few cosmetic injuries?" The word, cosmetic, hung in the air, a deliberate, calculated cruelty. A gasp went through the crowd. Clara's hand went instinctively to her cheek, her composure finally beginning to crack. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the pity, the morbid curiosity, and for a moment, the old, familiar shame threatened to drown her. Her voice trembled as she tried to answer. They were not," she faltered, the words catching in her throat. Her gaze darted around the room, lost and desperate, until it found him. Eli. He was leaning forward, his hands clenched on the head of his cane. He met her eyes, and the entire world narrowed to the space between them. He saw her fear, her hesitation. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then, his voice, not loud, but carrying with an absolute authority across the silent room, said 2 words. "Don't look away." The words were a command, a plea, a lifeline. They were not for the town, or the judge, or the jury of gawking faces. They were for her. They were a reminder of who she was, of what she had survived. A deep breath shuddered through her. She straightened her spine. She dropped her hand from her face and turned back to the lawyer, her one good eye blazing with a fire that made him take an involuntary step back. "They were not cosmetic injuries," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength, clear and cold as a steel bell. "They were the result of my husband pouring a full can of lamp oil on me as I slept and setting me on fire with a match because I dared to tell him I was leaving. I did not escape. I was dragged out by a neighbor who heard my screams. My husband died because the fire he set to murder me trapped him in his own house. That is the truth, and I will not hide from it, or from these scars, for you or for any other man, ever again." She had spoken her truth, and the truth had set her free. The rest of the trial was a formality. The judge, a stern man with eyes that saw everything, ruled in her favor, declaring her a victim of a terrible crime, not a perpetrator. Caleb Stone was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor for the burning of her cabin and the attempted murder of Eli Cartwright. Justice, delayed for so long, had finally been served. Life in Redemption Creek found a new rhythm. The town, in its own way, had been reborn, humbled by its own fallibility. Clara, with a loan from the mercantile owner and the help of the whole community, reopened her sewing shop in a new building, a small, solid structure on the main street. The townsfolk came not to whisper, but to buy and to praise. They brought her their finest fabrics, their most challenging projects, not just because she was the best seamstress in the territory, but because it was an honor to have something made by the hands of Clara Mayfield. Eli, his leg slowly healing into a permanent, stiff-limbed limp, spent his days at her new shop. He did not go back to the high country. His life was here now. With his own 2 hands, he built a wide, covered porch onto the front of her shop. The sound of his hammer, steady and rhythmic, became a part of the town's daily music, the sound of a future being built, one nail at a time. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, they sat together on the porch he had just finished. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine. He was quiet for a long time, watching the last of the light fade from the mountains. Then he turned to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring, a plain band of silver that shone softly in the twilight. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I am not a man of many words, and I do not have much to offer, just a lame leg and a quiet life. But if you will have me, I would be honored to be your husband." She looked at him, at his good, honest face, at the love that shone, clear and steady, in his dark eyes. There were no tears. Her life had been washed clean of tears. There was only a deep, profound, and certain joy.
"Yes, Eli,"
she said, her voice as steady as his gaze.
"Yes."
They were married a week later. Not in the church, but down by the creek, the place where their quiet conversations had first begun. The preacher said the words, but the river and the mountains were their true witnesses. She wore a simple blue dress, and she carried a small bunch of wild prairie flowers. Her veil was gone. His limp was a permanent part of him. They stood side by side, 2 imperfect, scarred people, and in their joining, they became irrevocably, undeniably whole. That night, she led him by the hand, not to a new house, but back to the place where their story had truly begun. The bathing tent still stood behind the livery, a humble canvas monument to her confession and his acceptance. She stepped inside. This time, he was already waiting for her, the soft lantern light casting a warm glow on his face. He was not washing away the trail dust. He was simply waiting. For her. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. A smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. She looked at the man who had seen the worst of her and called her beautiful. The man who had faced down her ghosts and his own. The man who was now her husband, and with no fear, no shame, and a heart full of love. She began to untie her dress. He didn't look away. Not now. Not ever. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.